It's early morning on the day after Ash Wednesday. The year is 1600. Giordano Bruno rides into Rome's Campo de' Fiori on a mule. Bruno is gagged with a leather bridle that prevents him from shouting out heresies to the people in the plaza. The mule stops when it reaches a pile of firewood, charcoal, kindling, and pitch. The guards strip Bruno and tie him to a stake that stands in the firewood. A priest holds up a crucifix to Bruno's face. Bruno turns his head away. An official steps forward to light the pyre, and soon the flames leap up to consume the heretic. The church records for that morning report the basic facts. Bruno, quote, was led by officers of the law to Campo de' Fiori, and there, stripped naked and tied to the stake. He was burned alive, always accompanied by the comforters up to the last, urging him to abandon his obstinacy, with which he ended his miserable life. The execution of Bruno represents a failure of the Roman Inquisition to perform its mission. Its mission was to admonish and persuade, not to terrify or punish. And Bruno's death will haunt the man most responsible for it, Cardinal Robert Bellarmine. Bellarmine will learn from Bruno's case. He will proceed differently 15 years later when he has to deal with another obstinate heretic, a scientist named Galileo. Who is Giordano Bruno, and what path led him to the stake in Rome? Well, to put it briefly, Bruno was one of the most original thinkers of the 16th century, a man who held ideas that seemed surprisingly modern for his age. Too modern, as it turned out. In 1562, at the age of 14, Bruno left his childhood home, a farmhouse near a small settlement of Nola, Italy. His destination was Naples, 30 miles to the west. Filippo, as he was called at the time, was a precocious boy, and because Naples was then the 5th largest city in the world, it is easy to imagine the attraction that it would have held for him. What Filippo did in Naples the first couple of years after his arrival, we do not know. Somehow he earned enough money to survive. It is also clear that he spent a great deal of time reading, studying, training his memory, and thinking. By age 17, Bruno entered the monastery of San Domenico Maggiore, where he took the name Giordano. San Domenico upheld the high intellectual standards. It was there that Bruno delved into both scholastic philosophy and Neoplatonism. Scholastic philosophy was still riding high at the time, having dominated teaching for almost 500 years. The philosophy was built on the ideas of Aristotle, was reconsidered by St. Thomas Aquinas. A contending philosophy, Neoplatonism, based on Plato's more poetic ideas of the world, was entering a period of revival. Bruno took strands from each of these two philosophic traditions and wove his own philosophy. Bruno's nonconformist thinking concerned officials at the monastery. Bruno raised eyebrows when he removed from his room pictures of the Virgin Mary and all other religious decorations, save for a single crucifix. His reading habits also worried officials. Bruno read and made margin notes in a book banned at the convent, Erasmus's paraphrases of the New Testament. When officials discovered the banned book in a latrine that Bruno had used, he undoubtedly received at least a stern lecture, if not the convent's equivalent of probation. In the privacy of his own head, Bruno was having even more scandalous thoughts that would have shocked officials if they knew. Bruno was experiencing doubts that Jesus was the Son of God, incarnate in human flesh, a central teaching of the Catholic Church. Nonetheless, everyone saw that Bruno was a brilliant student, so authorities tolerated his indiscretions and idiosyncrasies. Bruno made a name for himself experimenting with artificial memory, techniques first developed in ancient Greece and Rome. The techniques linked words or phrases to vivid images through the use of so-called memory palaces. His mastery of the technique and almost unbelievable memory amazed everyone. Convent officials even sent Bruno to Rome to perform feats of memory before Pope Pius V. By age 24, Bruno had become a priest and gained admission as a formal student of theology to a college attached to San Domenico Maggiore. This, by the way, is the same college where Thomas Aquinas taught briefly toward the end of his life in the 13th century. 3 years into his training, however, authorities informed Bruno that he was under investigation by the Inquisition. Why is not clear. According to Ingrid Rowland in her book Giordano, Bruno, Philosopher Heretic, the main charge was likely that Bruno's defense of certain early Christian heretics had bothered authorities. He had questioned Christ's divinity. Bruno decided to get out of Naples while the going was still good. Shortly after learning of the proceedings against him, Bruno headed to a convent in Rome, and after a brief stay there, he shed the garments of a friar and hit the road. Traveling as Filippo Bruno, a gentleman, he trekked north to Genoa, then on to the seaside village of Noli, where he landed a job teaching grammar to children. For the next 15 years, Bruno traveled the roads of Europe from one city to the next. Never did he stay more than 3 years in any one city. Wherever he went, he wrote and sought jobs teaching philosophy. In 1577, Bruno arrived in Geneva, the intellectual and spiritual center of Calvinism. There he converted to Protestantism and enrolled at the university as Philippus Brunus Nolanos, professor of sacred theology. But Bruno was Bruno, with his knack for getting in trouble. While at the university, he couldn't resist publishing a broadsheet attacking the philosophical ideas of a senior teacher. Mind you, this was not a time when campuses were known for their protection of free speech. Bruno was arrested and spent 2+ weeks in jail, released only when he agreed to apologize on his knees to the senior professor. After his forced apology, Bruno set off for Lyon and then Toulouse, France. He found another teaching job, lecturing at the city's university on Aristotle. Next, it was on to Paris, where he published a book about memorization techniques. Intrigued by the techniques, King Henry III made Bruno his private tutor, professor, and royal reader. Bruno's job was to instruct the king and members of his court on the art of memorization, logic, and metaphysics. Those days in Paris, teaching and enjoying the good life, must have been Bruno's best. It was also a very creative period for him. He wrote a remarkable black comedic play about life in Naples called The Candlemaker. Bruno might happily have spent the rest of his days in Paris. Rumors floated that the Inquisition was coming to France. It was time to go. Bruno moved to England, where he found himself seen as something of an odd duck. In a theology debate at Oxford, people laughed at him because of his strange gestures, his physical appearance, and his accent. Bruno was thin-skinned, and the insult stung. Forever after, Bruno expressed his hatred for the English. He wrote, for example, "The English look down their noses, laugh at you, and fart at you with their lips." All was not wasted in Oxford, however. Bruno developed ideas about the universe that marked him as an original thinker of the first order. He married the controversial Copernican model of the solar system with a version of Platonic theology to produce a view of the universe that was entirely new. In London, Bruno expanded on his original and most would have said eccentric views. He published a dialogue which suggested that the universe was far larger than Copernicus ever imagined. He saw a universe with millions of inhabited planets, circling millions of suns. In subsequent dialogues, Bruno argued that once people become aware of the fact that they live in a vast, inhabited, and infinitely old universe, their lives will be transformed for the better. Now, it is almost impossible to overstate how mind-blowing these ideas must have seemed to people at the time. And Bruno's wild thoughts were not confined to the vastness of the universe. He was also thinking and writing about things almost infinitely small. Bruno promoted an atomic theory which posited that every physical thing is made up of identical particles, in Bruno's terminology, seeds. Bruno believed that in these seeds, God and his informing love resided. By the late 16th century, Bruno had developed a new philosophy, a new set of religious beliefs, one outside the scope of previous Western thought. His philosophy brought together ideas about the unimaginably large and the unimaginably small, unified by a belief in an omnipresent, loving God. Even though his ideas owed little to empirical observation or mathematics, Bruno's natural philosophy comes closer to our modern understanding of the cosmos than any other thinker of the 16th or 17th century. Remarkable when you think about it. Bruno spent 2 years in England, but then in 1585, his friend and patron in London, the French ambassador, was recalled to Paris. The recall of his patron left Bruno little choice but to follow him. But Paris was not the Paris that Bruno used to know and love. The city was on the verge of religious war. So just after a year, Bruno fled to Germany. And just as he had once found himself in the seat of Calvinism, Bruno now wound up in the town where Martin Luther had launched the Reformation, Wittenberg. It's not clear that he formally embraced Lutheranism, but at a time when there were tensions between Lutherans and Calvinists in Germany, he aligned himself with the Lutherans. He lectured at the University of Wittenberg for about a year, then moved on to Prague and then to the Lutheran University of Helmstedt. But there were troubles brewing there too. Fights broke out between Calvinist and Lutheranist factions. So Bruno moved on to his last Northern European stop, Frankfurt, and there he published his last two works, marking the end of a prolific publishing career, 30 books over 2 decades. So the picture we get of Giordano Bruno is this. He is a committed maverick, a misfit, a man who despised the mindless acceptance of traditional teachings. In that sense, Bruno's heresy, as his biographer Michael White notes, was all-embracing. He believed in the right that every person has to think as they wish. Reason, not orthodoxy, was Bruno's guiding star. Doubt all things is the advice he gave to philosophers. Bruno is sometimes compared to Copernicus before him and Galileo after. Copernicus did influence Bruno's thinking, and to an extent, Bruno helped open Galileo's eyes to the heavens. Bruno, however, was not a researcher, not an experimenter, and not a mathematician. Bruno was a thinker. He was an early practitioner of the sort of thought experiments that centuries later would be employed by Heisenberg, Schrödinger, and Einstein. At a time when almost no one else could, Bruno imagined a universe that was both infinite and one, a universe in which everything is everything else. While Bruno was in Frankfurt, a wealthy Venetian gentleman, Giovanni Mocenigo, invited him to come to Venice. Mocenigo had read several of Bruno's writings and was so intrigued that he asked the philosopher to live in his residence and tutor him. In what ultimately proved to be a fatal decision, Bruno accepted the offer. He must have understood the risk he was taking. But after 20 years of exile, we can imagine Bruno, homesick, longing to hear again his native tongue and see once more the land of his youth. In 1592, Bruno moved to Venice and there took up residence in Mocenigo's home. Things went well at first, but soon Mocenigo suspected Bruno of holding heretical beliefs. He also believed that Bruno was withholding from him knowledge of some of his most effective memory tricks. His memory hadn't improved as much as he'd hoped. Finally, he thought that Bruno was becoming, let's say, a bit too friendly with his wife. Uncertain what to do, Mocenigo disclosed concerns about Bruno to his father confessor. The father confessor urged him to denounce Bruno to the Holy Office. Now, Bruno sensed that not all was well between him and his host. He announced that time had come to leave Venice and return to Germany. And that swung Mocenigo into action. Bruno later described what happened next. Mocenigo ordered 5 or 6 servants to lift me out of my bed and carry me to the attic of the palazzo. Locked in the attic, Bruno was told by Mocenigo that unless he revealed his best secrets for memorizing words, something unpleasant would happen to him. Bruno replied, "I have taught you enough, and more than I was obliged to, and I do not deserve to be treated like this." The next day, Mocenigo reported Bruno to the civil authorities. The authorities in turn delivered him to the Inquisition. Mocenigo prepared a 3-page letter to the Inquisition, which included a long series of accusations against Bruno. The letter is written in the shaky hand of an infuriated man. Mocenigo claimed to have heard Bruno say that it is a great blasphemy for Catholics to say that bread transmutes the flesh. He accused Bruno of being an enemy of the Mass and of saying that Christ is a wretch. He also wrote that Bruno revealed plans to make himself the head of a new sect under the name of a new philosophy, and that the Virgin could not have given birth, and that our Catholic opinions are the teaching of asses. Any one of these accusations, if proven, could spell trouble for Bruno. He was interrogated in jail and deposed 6 times by 3 judges. Confined in his jail, Bruno cursed God and bickered with fellow prisoners. One of the prisoners Bruno argued with was a friar with a history of mental instability named Celestino Erigone. The friar reported Bruno's transgressions to the inquisitors. Among other things, the friar said that Bruno had addressed God blasphemously with the words, "Traitor, take that wretched cuckold. Look how you run the world." If the friar is to be believed, Bruno also gave heaven the finger. Finally, the friar testified, during one heated theological argument, Bruno slapped him. Bruno's former host, Mocenigo, identified 3 potential witnesses for the Inquisition. All 3 men were summoned to appear, but none of them really provided much support for the case against Bruno. A bookshop owner testified that Bruno never said anything to make me think he was not a good Catholic or a good Christian. Another witness said Bruno spent most of his time writing and going around talking riddles and astrologizing new things. The witness noted Bruno read heretical teachers, but added he seemed to be a good Christian. In his own depositions, Bruno admitted to having some doubts about some tenets of Catholicism, but denied holding or advocating heretical positions. He did, however, make an unwise admission. Bruno told his inquisitors that ever since he was a young friar, he harbored doubts about whether Jesus was the Son of God. It's this omission that seems to have been the statement that most bothered the inquisitors. It was likely their excuse for keeping him in prison even after, at his final deposition on July 30th, 1592, Bruno retracted and renounced all the beliefs and positions attributed to him by his Venetian host in his original letter of accusation. On his knees before the 3 judges, Bruno said, "I humbly beg pardon of the Lord God and your illustrious lordships for all the errors I have committed, and am ready to carry out whatever your prudence shall have deliberated and judged expedient to my soul." But Bruno still could not stop himself. While in his cell in Venice, awaiting a decision by Venetian authorities and a request by Rome for his extradition to that city, Bruno got into yet another heated religious argument with fellow prisoners, both of whom were friars. The argument concerned a statement that the Bible says Jesus made on the cross. "Father, let this cup pass me by." Bruno argued that the statement proved that Jesus was mortal. The friars begged to differ. It took months for the decision to be made regarding Bruno's extradition to Rome. But in February 1593, Venetian authorities loaded Bruno on a ship bound for the prisons of the Roman Inquisition. For the final 7 years of his life, Bruno lived in a private cell located just south of St. Peter's Square. While Bruno sat in his cell in Rome, his former cellmate in Venice, Friar Celestino, produced a list of 13 of Bruno's statements and actions in prison, which the friar believed were heretical. One of the friar's charges concerned Bruno's cosmology. The friar reports that Bruno believed that there are many worlds and that all stars are worlds, and that he thinks anyone who believes that this is the only world is extremely ignorant. He also charged Bruno with making light of biblical stories. The friar said Bruno claimed that Moses only pretended to talk to God on Mount Sinai, and that the law he gave to the Hebrew people was made up by himself. He also reported that Bruno wanted to return to Germany or England, among the heretics, where he could live in his own way and plant his new and infinite heresies. The friar's shocking charges prompted church officials in Rome to ask questions of all of Bruno's former cellmates that they could find. Their interviews, for the most part, confirmed the friar's allegations. Roman inquisitors examined the transcripts from the proceeding against Bruno in Venice, and they noted in the transcripts the large number of references to Bruno's early writings. Over a strikingly long period of time, roughly 6 years, officials struggled to prepare a complete list of Bruno's writings and to track down every surviving copy in whatever parts of Europe they might be found. Bruno, meanwhile, used his time in prison to draft his defense. In 1599, Jesuit theologian Robert Bellarmine, who had served as a consultant to the Inquisition since 1592, was made a cardinal by Pope Clement VIII. After getting his red hat, Bellarmine was appointed directly to the Board of Inquisition, and once there, Cardinal Bellarmine plotted to use his new power and his incisive mind to turn the screws on Giordano Bruno. Bellarmine pored over the list of Bruno's possible heresies and reduced them to 8 propositions. Bellarmine proposed that Bruno would have to abjure each one of these 8 propositions if he wished to save his life. Now, the actual record of the 8 propositions has been lost, but the Church's summary of Bruno's trial provides several clues as to what might have been on the list. The summary indicates that there are 4 general subjects of concern on which Bruno refused to budge. They included his beliefs about the divinity and incarnation of Christ, the existence of multiple worlds, the souls of humans and animals, and the art of divination. Bruno's opinions on all these matters, as well as his contention that the sin of the flesh is not a mortal sin, became the central focus of Bellarmine's questioning. Bruno responded to the cardinal's questions with the demand that Bellarmine prove that the Pope considered each of these 8 propositions to be definitely heretical. Bruno told Bellarmine that if he could provide proof that the Pope's stance on these 8 propositions, then he would consider abjuring his positions. To Bellarmine, this demand must have seemed like pure insolence. At the very least, Bruno's demand for papal intervention failed to help his case. Equally unhelpful was Bruno's final retort to Bellarmine. After a series of escalating insults, Bruno told Bellarmine, "You lie through your throat." Frustrated by his intransigence, Bruno's inquisitors debated whether to subject him to torture. Historical records do not reveal whether or not torture was actually inflicted. At the very least, Bruno must have been aware of the threat. And for many prisoners, the threat alone would have been enough to produce a retraction. But not for Bruno. As Ingrid Rowland puts it in her biography of Bruno, in his own way, in his own terms, Giordano Bruno now began to prepare for his own martyrdom. Bruno was forced to kneel before his inquisitors. He heard his sentence. "We declare you, the aforementioned Friar Giordano Bruno, to be an impenitent, pertinacious, an obstinate heretic. We now expel you from our ecclesiastical bar and from our holy and immaculate church, of whose mercy you have now rendered yourself unworthy." Bruno replied, "You may be more afraid to bring that sentence against me than I am to accept it." It took some time for the Inquisition to decide to burn Bruno at the stake. Church officials had to weigh the political risk of offending some of Bruno's powerful friends around Europe. Bruno had shared his knowledge and his ideas for years, sometimes with kings, ambassadors, and dukes. Rome had reason to worry that his execution might have political repercussions. Execution also represented a failure of sorts. The Roman Inquisition set as its goal serving Christ through admonition and persuasion, not through punishment. But decide they finally did, and on February 8, 1600, church officials performed a solemn degradation. In this ceremony, Bruno was stripped of his symbols of priesthood, his deacon's stole, his subdeacon's alb and maniple, his acolyte's candle, his Dominican scapular, and his habit. And then he was shaved, dressed in the clothes of a layman, and turned over to a bailiff. The bailiff represented the secular arm of the Roman government. Secular authorities did the dirty work, not the church. The bailiff transported Bruno to the prison of Torre Nona, and for the next 8 days, various friars made unsuccessful appeals to Bruno to repent. Then the end came, on February 17, 1600. Did it really have to end at the stake? After all, Bruno had killed no one, led no insurrections, stolen nothing. His crime was to write and argue. Bruno was killed because of his ideas. Ideas that were original, thoughtful, beautiful in a way, but inconsistent with those of the church. Bruno burned because Cardinal Bellarmine concluded there was no way of bringing this brilliant and stubborn man into line. And in the year 1600, maintaining lines is what the church did. Times have changed. Today, Giordano Bruno is widely seen as a martyr to the cause of free speech. A large statue of Bruno rises at the site of his execution. Bronze letters on the granite pedestal proclaim, "To Bruno, from the generation he foresaw here, where the pyre burned." And every February 17th, the mayor of Rome lays a wreath draped in red and gold ribbons at Bruno's feet. The burning of Giordano Bruno came to haunt the man most responsible for it, Cardinal Robert Bellarmine. Within a decade of Bruno's execution, Galileo Galilei was using his telescope to observe the heavens. He became the first human to see the moons of Jupiter, the rings of Saturn, sunspots, and the craters of the moon. And what he saw convinced him that Copernicus had it right, that the earth revolved around the sun rather than the other way around as Catholic orthodoxy had it. For Bellarmine, the earth could not revolve around the sun for the simple reason, as he expressed in a letter. In Genesis, the Psalms, Ecclesiastes, and Joshua, you will find all agreeing that the sun is in the heaven and turns around the earth with great speed, and that the earth is very far from the heaven and sits motionless at the center of the world. In other words, Bellarmine believed in a geocentric cosmos because the Bible told him so. And yet, having learned a lesson in the Bruno case, Bellarmine approached this new threat posed by Galileo with care. He moved slowly, sought to avoid having the matter blow up. Bellarmine didn't condemn Galileo, he cautioned him. In 1615, he told Galileo and other scientists to treat their Copernican views as hypotheses and not as facts. In the next year, the eyes of the church officials, Galileo crossed the line and openly advocated Copernican views. Bellarmine again warned Galileo not to hold, teach, or defend Copernican theory, but he did not and would not put Galileo on trial. Now, Galileo finally faced the Inquisition in 1632. That's 11 years after Bellarmine's death. He was tried for violating a 1616 injunction allegedly issued by Cardinal Bellarmine, but one which almost all historians believe was post-dated, an invention by the church officials, anxious to silence the great scientist. There's good reason to believe that had Bellarmine not learned the cautionary lesson that he did in the Bruno case, Galileo might well have been silenced and punished in the prime of his life, rather than at the end of his productive career. One final thought to consider about this rather unlikely pair, Bruno the philosopher, Galileo the scientist. Galileo, in the end, chose to recant his ideas and live. Bruno was the braver of the two men. He chose to die for his ideas.